Welcome to JLive. I'm Laura Mandel, J Arts Executive Director, and it's great to be with you for JLive, our virtual series where we bring you bite-sized conversations about Jewish life and art with the best artists with Boston connections. Today, I'm with photography-based visual artist Adriana Katzew, who teaches at Mass Art and who we are lucky enough to call an inaugural Community Creative Fellow. Welcome, Adriana.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be with you today because I think your work is so beautiful and I'm excited to expose everybody to what you're working on for this fellowship. So for those of you who don't know, this fellowship is a new partnership with CJP Arts and Culture, and it's actually the first program of this type in the country, offering all of us opportunities to engage with Adriana and Yoni, our other fellow, while also offering professional development for the artists. And so today it's exciting because it'll give you a little bit of a snapshot into Adriana's work, what she's done in the past, and what she's going to be doing for this fellowship. If you have questions while we're talking, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many of them as time allows. So, Adriana, let's start off with some of your work. Let's thinking of this moment as like a visual timestamp. Tell us, like, who are you through your art?
Sure. I would describe myself as an artist, a person who really tells stories through my work. I try to really bring stories that often are at the margins or are invisible to the forefront. That's what I would say really encapsulates my work. And a lot of it also, Laura, has to do about relationships. A lot of my work makes connections, even if they're objects, there's a relationship to them, there's a story to them. And so I would say that's what encapsulates my work in general.
That's great. So let's look at some of your pieces.
Yes.
I know we have some slides.
Yes. So this is a series I did a few years ago. This is when I was living in Vermont. And at that time, there was a large number of Mexican and Guatemalan migrant workers that were coming to work in the dairy farms. And it became to me so obvious that they were having a really tough experience. And I got to interview some of them and help them fill out some of their documentation to be in the US. And their stories could not be really told in some ways because the INS was so present in Vermont at that time that they were almost like hidden people. And I really wanted to tell the stories but not put them in danger. And I ended up taking photos of that's like a typical Vermont milk bottle, but I ended up using images from the 1920s, again, of Mexican migrant workers. And the series was called Y se repite because it's the idea that the conditions of migrant workers keeps repeating itself in the history of the US over time. So here are two images of a very broad series of work. And if we have the next slide, I can show you another body of work. This was a body of work that I finished around 2017. It was called the Bee Project. And again, it was based on these photo albums and other objects that were given to me by a family friend of a Texan Jewish woman who didn't have any children, so her objects couldn't go back to her. And for 20 years, I logged her objects. I couldn't, as a photographer, throw away her photo album, even if I never met her. And then one day in a class, it just sort of like I had the idea of make work about this woman, research who she was, use the objects to tell her story. And in doing so, I uncovered so much about her life and about the role of Jewish women in Texas, the long history of Jewish population in Texas, and what it meant to be a woman in the she was born around 1901, what was it like to be a Texan Jewish woman at that time. And what you can see here is a series of 3 images. It's based on one of her photographs. The profile that you see is from a photograph of her on her wedding day for her second marriage. And it tells a little bit of a story about herself, but also the community in which she lived. This is a photo of a group of her friends. It means it's a group of her friends, and none of them ever chose to have children. And that's a story that I don't know why that was, but it stuck with me. These decisions that women would do or could do, or maybe what's the story there for this group of women? So that was, again, another series of work, and it was also very much based on the objects that Bee had left behind. And I think now I can show you what I'm working on. Is that good to now go into that?
Yeah,
Laura?
that's
Okay.
perfect.
Okay.
I just have to say I'm so appreciative of how much, you're talking about it as storytelling, but you're also really a historian. You're really bringing out these layers of history through this storytelling. It's really special.
Yeah, I mean, I graduated from my undergrad as a history and literature major. So I think part of my thinking is always I bring a whole bunch of stuff into it, right? I don't just go into the art making, but I really do research. I really read a lot of books, some of them literature, some of the history as I try to tell the story. So certainly for the B piece, I was reading a lot about the Texan Jewish population, the Southern Jews population, a population I didn't know anything about. So that was interesting. And for this series of work, this is part of my fellowship work that I'm doing now. It really started, I had initially thought I would do about this intersectionality, about being Jewish and also Latina, very specifically Mexican American. And that's how it started, right? That was my idea. And it started changing. I started thinking, in order for me to tell that story, which is really particularly mine, I have to go back and tell the story of my grandparents who moved from, I'm talking more about my maternal grandparents, with whom I grew up very closely, but they moved from Poland to Mexico, right, at the end of the 1920s when the US had closed borders. And so again, a lot of research goes into this. I'm trying to figure out what parts of their personal stories we know through my mom, who's been wonderful in sharing all that she knows, and also sort of a little bit of the larger framework to it. What were the history of Jews who ended up in Mexico, both Ashkenazi Jews, that means Jews from Eastern Europe, as well as Jews that came from other regions, so who were Sephardic from Spain, France, Morocco, and also Mizrahi Jews who came from other places in the Middle East. So I ended up really, Laura, this piece really was about me trying to imagine what it would have been for my grandparents coming from small towns in Eastern Poland to Mexico, taking their first boat, transatlantic steamship, to Mexico. And it turns out that those boat rides would last 28 days. And they were just newlyweds. And I'm thinking, what would it be like to be a newlywed for 28 days traveling, and all you have to see is ocean, right? Knowing that you're never going to see your family, you're never going to see your land, and you're going to a place that you know virtually nothing about. A whole different climate, a whole different food. And you're newlyweds, you're about 18 years old. And from what my mom tells me, it was a very rocky boat ride. And so I really wanted to depict this idea of them looking out through the portholes for 28 days. So this is going to be an accordion book that includes 28 days of travel. And what you see here is photographs that are of the ocean by Veracruz, which is where they arrived. And it's sort of the port where a lot of people who would travel to Mexico arrived in. It's a little bit akin to Ellis Island. And so these are images from postcards and other documentation, other photographs of the 1920s in Veracruz. I really wanted to capture that ocean at that time period. And the next slide, I can show you a little bit about the process, which is kind of interesting. For me to make the artwork, different artists approach their work very differently. Some of them, my earpiece keeps falling off. Some of them just start by making, and then they zoom out and they think, what have I made? But I start with ideas in mind, and I have my journal or my sketchbook, and I really jot them down. And here you can see a couple of pages from my journal. That's an image from my grandmother's own immigration documentation. You can see here, these are some of the ideas of what I already wanted to do, which was, I was already interested about this boat ride, right? What would this journey be like? What would it would it entail? And looking at names of ships. And on the right, you start seeing other sketches about sort of like trying to think about what my grandmother represented for me, what my grandfather, and these senses that I associate with them through food and through smells and through objects in their home. And if we can go to the next slide, I can show you a little bit more of the process. So here's just an image. I mean, I'm always, like I was saying, there's a stack of books that keep coming to me as I create a particular body of work. And obviously it changes on the body of work. Here, The book on the right was recommended by my dear colleague Dalia Wasner at Brandeis. And on the left, it's a whole bunch of books, one from the ICA on a show that they had on migration, books on art, on bookmaking, since that's the form that I seem to be using, books about the Jewish community in Mexico that my mom had given me, a poetry book, a book about the symbolism of the blue color in in Judaism, some books that were written by the first generation of Jews that went to Mexico that I found. And even my child, so I was reading him this children's book that's called When the Sea Turned to River, that is beautiful. It's about storytelling, which is a lot about what my work is. So anything I grab on when I'm making art, I'm always in my mind, I'm thinking about what I'm making, and I grab pieces from whatever I can, including films that you can see on top of that stash. One is a documentary about Jewish immigration to Mexico in the 1920s. And another one, which was the neighborhood that my grandparents ended up living in for many years when they arrived, which was one of the poorest and quite dangerous neighborhood in Mexico City. And I can show you, if there's another slide, I can show you a little bit of more of the process. How it goes for me is I start by, I don't know, I think I was sitting in the dining room and I kept thinking about portholes to tell this story. And I ended up, I had some watercolors and I ended up drawing a little porthole right there while I was probably eating. And from that, I started thinking, I have some sort of like hole punch that makes holes. And I started punching holes of some paper making project I had done several years ago. You can see that little green hole because it looked like ocean to me. And first I thought, oh, maybe I'll use this as background. And if we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit more of the process. I ended up thinking, I have no idea what a porthole looks like. I actually hate ships. I hate being in the water because I get seasick. And so part of it was like researching, what did portholes look like? What did portholes in steamboats from the 1920s look like? What color should I draw it? Because there was a whole bunch of colors. And at that time, through one of our mentors through the fellowship, Rabbi Schwartz, I asked him, what is the symbolism of colors in the Jewish religion? And so it turns out silver has quite a bit of symbolism. And so that's how I decided to use silver for it. Again, all trying to layer the symbols here. And on the right, you can see a whole bunch of images of the Veracruz body of water, and the sky, and I'm trying to decide what circles to use. You can see I drew circles and I was hole punching them and then making the decision about what images to use. And if we go to the next slide. So again, a lot of my work entails research, but a lot of the work for this series for this series and for previous one entails objects that I already have. And here you can see that this is my grandfather's talit, which is the prayer shawl that is used in the synagogue. And so I'm very fortunate that I'm the person who has it. And so basically what I started to do, Laura, is I basically started to pull it apart. I took it out from this little sort of purple bag and I started unfolding it. And this is a very sacred object, right? And so I'm unfolding it in my dining room table. In these times you work wherever you can. And what was really fun is that at one point, if you can see the image on the right, I found some stains on it. And I said to my husband, is that a blood stain? So he gave me this little object to look at it up close, right? This little loop. And it turns out it's mole sauce. So mole is a sauce we eat a lot in Mexico. It's made out of chocolate and chiles and other condiments. And I just started laughing, right? Because here is this sacred objects that this object, right? The talit. And then here's mole, right? So this idea that you have a religious sacred object and this everyday life, which is you eat. And also the syncretism of Mexican and Jewish cultures, right? This Jewish object and then a very typical Mexican food, the mole. And I just bursted out laughing. And I remember calling my mom and I said, did Zayda eat? Zayda is the word in Yiddish for grandfather. Did he eat mole? Right? And she said, yes, he loved mole. And it is clearly the color of mole. It's not the color of wine. It's very specifically the color of mole. I've stained many things with mole, so I know that color. And I just bursted out laughing and I said, Mom, why would he be wearing his talit? well, he's eating mole. What would lead him to do that? Why not take it away, right? So again, this moments of real life with sacredness happening for him. And if we see the next image, let's see.
I just have to say, I
Yeah.
understand why your students love learning with you, because you have this incredible way of putting the history and context into just such simple terms with such meaning.
Yes, I mean it's we live life and we're trying to capture that, and so we have the everyday, but we also have the historical context that frames us, right? And so
Yeah.
we're always shifting back and forth, understanding those many levels that we're at. So then, after I had the talita and I photographed it and I found the mole stain, as you well know, Laura, we have a lot of Zoom meetings, and I'm an artist and I need to move my hands. And I think this meeting might have been a 5-hour meeting. I have to confess. And so my brain has to be working. And so I took out my piece of paper and I started to think about how I could make an image of my grandfather's talit. How could I make it as a book, right? And so I'm here sketching it, and I think you can see on the right is that loop with the mole stain, because I want to involve that. I want to create that place of the sacred and the mundane that food is, right? The everyday coming with it. And so I started sketching it out, and as you can see, also I started doing I started to prototype my little book in this 5-hour meeting. Confession of what happens in meetings when you're in your house. And if we have the next slide, and this is not a finished piece, but this is what I'm working, and I just wanted to show a piece in process. That's my grandfather's talit, and that in the back I really wanted to also bring the symbolism of the color, right, of this blue that is so sacred in Jewish religion. It's created from a mollusk, from what I understand, and I really wanted to bring it. Is the tehelet. And one of my fabulous students is working in a series of cyanotypes, which is a photography printmaking method. And I thought, that's it. The cyanotype to me is sort of the color that closely comes to this symbolic Jewish color. And so here you see just how I'm trying to play with the symbolism of the color with the talit, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to bring the color of the mole into this piece, right? So that it continues to have the sacred and the everyday experience kind of blended in together. And let me see if there's another slide. I'm not sure. Yes. And I don't know if you want to talk about this
So
or not.
before we go to the activity, I
Yeah.
just have to tell you, I have heard you tell variations of this story a few times over, but every time I listen to you, I am inspired all over again. It's amazing to me how you really at your core are a historian, and then you put it into a visual context that we can all understand.
Yes, no, and I think what's been wonderful is that through the fellowship we've gotten mentorship from Rabbi Schwartz, and also from Tova's Peter, right, who has been wonderful. And so she's the one who told me about this color. And she said, go and get this book. And so here you can imagine I'm reading this book and I'm making the piece. So all these things, it's, I think I mentioned this in another conversation with you, Laura, is that I sort of go into rabbit holes, right? Because I'm a researcher. So I'm like, oh, I must get that book. I must understand it at a certain level. So I go into that rabbit hole of the idea of the colors. And then I go into the rabbit hole about Veracruz, right? Which was the point where my grandparents arrived. What other populations arrived? Not just Jews arrived there, right? So there was a variety of populations that arrived. And so then I'm pulling out articles to try and to understand also the history of Jews at that time, the history of Mexico, when did it close itself to Mexican immigration, and also to understand just many of the layers of what's happened throughout the time in our cultures.
Yeah, no, it's really beautiful, and it's fascinating to watch your process and to hear more about it. So, okay, what I love is what you were about to show us as an activity. So I'm excited about this because I know this is something you're going to be doing as part of the fellowship, but you want to give us all a taste. So tell us.
Yeah, so as part of the fellowship, what's beautiful about this fellowship is that we get to make our own work, our own body of work, and we also get to, inspired by our own work, we get to create workshops and take them to the community, right? And so we are in the time of COVID, and I'm trying to think about what kind of activities can we make with whatever materials we have at home, right? So part of it is like, because I'm working with objects that have a lot of meaning for me in my life, in the history of my family, I really wanted to bring those to the forefront. And I'm very fortunate that that our other fellow Yoni also gets to be very interested in objects, right? The meaning of these precious objects is these objects that tell stories, that let us have windows into our pasts, that let us have windows into our present, that allows us to tell the stories for the future of our children or the future of our communities, whatever that means, and our own creative sort of way of thinking, right? So one of the projects, and if we can go to the next slide. So this is one activity that we'll be doing in some of the workshops, but I wanted to share it now because I know that we're all locked in our homes, and sometimes even as artists and even other people, it's like, what can I do? Or we're a little bit all sort of disoriented in this moment that we're just here stuck, right? We're in this like liminal state. And so what I'm hoping to do in several of the workshops is allow people to choose an object that is meaningful to them. Maybe it's an object that somebody loved to them, gave them, or was in the family, or it's been passed down, or it's an object that has story for that particular individual, right? And my hope is that people will take this object and photograph them. And of course, you know, there's always like, because I'm a photographer, I don't really think about what it entails doing the photography, but I realized in a workshop that it's really important to say, place the object not against the light of a window, because then your object is totally dark, right? All you see is the light of the window, but to put it against a flat surface that has, that it's a uniform color, or grab any piece of paper you have and put this object, photograph it, as you could see with the talit that I had with I just really basically extended it. I was trying to think, how can I use this sacred object and photograph it in different ways, right? Look at it from up close, extend it out, the material, take photos of the mole sauce, little splatter there. And so making decisions about how you want to take a photograph of your object to tell the story that you want. And so here I chose to photograph a little perfume bottle that also is like a pendant that was my Bobes, my maternal grandmother. And I have to say, I never saw her wear it. I have no idea how this object has landed with me. I'm sure my mom gave it to me, but I have no recollection why it's with me. But when you open it, you can still smell the perfume. And this must be so old. And you can still smell it. There's no liquid in it, but you smell it. So again, all the senses, it's an opportunity for us to think about the objects and to think about the senses that connect us to these people that we love, or to these places that have connections for us through family objects. And so again, so you photograph this object, you decide how you need to do it. And there's a whole bunch of apps through the iPhone or through other computer programs that you can use to give them an effect. I'm pretty sure that for this one, I used Hipstamatic in my iPhone, and it allows you to sort of give different looks to your images, right? And I really wanted to capture the colors, but give it a little bit of a sense of old. A lot of my photographs, it turns out, they're sort of like nostalgic, a little bit melancholy. So it's not surprising that this would also have a little bit of that sense of nostalgia. And then together with once you have the object, it's really for people to think about what story can they tell about the object. And again, always thinking about how you may share this story with other loved people, with future generations, with communities, with people who are very different from you, that they may learn something about your experience through this image. And then in return, they can share about their own experience. again, so it's creating bridges between different groups of people, between different populations. And so in telling the stories, again, there's many ways to do it. I just wanted to share it. I use GoodNotes, which is another app that you can find because it allows you to type and you can use different fonts. So I really, again, for me, a font that has a lot of meaning is the one that looks like the old typewriters. You know, again, this idea of melancholy is makes its way to a lot of my work. But I also wanted to write with my own handwriting. And so this one application allows me to do it there. And so you can see that it says on the top, La botellita de perfume de la Bobe, the little perfume bottle of Bobe, which means in Yiddish grandmother. And then in the bottom, I wrote, so many years later, and the smell is still there. And yet I don't associate her with perfume, but with the smell of her cooking. Right? So this idea that we have associations with the people we love, with the objects that we hold. And yeah, so my hope is that in this time that we're all sort of locked down, people can use something as simple that they can find in their homes, photograph it, tell a story, maybe put in a book that they make, or just save these images. And my hope is that people will feel comfortable to share their photographs. One of the plans, aside from making a series of artist books for my own story of my grandparents and their own migration to Mexico, which in turn will allow me to make work about my own migration to the US, these multiple migrations and the stories that take place and that change as we change geographies, right? But my hope is that in doing so, people can really spend some time thinking about it and passing their stories through the arts. And that's what I hope with this activity. And that also my plan is to make a collective community piece that people who feel comfortable sharing photos of their objects and or their stories. If you don't feel comfortable with photography, the story is good. And if you don't feel comfortable telling the story, the image is good, is to create a big collective piece that weaves in all these stories and images. And my hope is in that collective story, we have an understanding of the individual ones, but we're part of something bigger, right? This migration is something that has happened to so many people who have come to the US, who have gone to other countries, and obviously not just Jewish people, but there's migrations from all over the world, past, present, and surely future. So again, how can this body of work, which is so much about my own history as being both Jewish and of Mexican descent, can be broadened and bridged with other people who have their own stories of migration, right?
It's really beautiful. And you should all know, I actually wore this ring especially for today because I was telling Adriana that this actually came from my grandmother from Germany it was made in the late 1800s. And she, like your grandparents, brought this on a ship across the ocean, not to Veracruz, but to Ellis Island. And so I'm definitely going to photograph this, but I think just for everyone out there to know that I would guess we all have something in this vein. And I just love that, Adriana, you've been able to bring this to the surface for us. So thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Yes, my pleasure. And for people who may not have an object from their families, right? I mean, different people have different circumstances. We all have an object, hopefully, of somebody who we love, that we can tap into it again. So for some of us, we have these objects from the past, but for other people, they can tap into objects that were given to in other circumstances. So again, it's about the stories in these objects. And we can, of course, each person has the creativity to reshape them and to tell their own story through these objects.
Beautiful. Okay, so we are running a little over time, but I have a few questions that have been sent in that I really want to ask you. So I'm going to let us go over time today. So as part of this process, something that I think is so special is that there's students from local day schools that you've already been engaging with around the project who've been reading your blogs and reading about your work and being inspired. And so I actually have a couple questions from students at different Jewish day schools around the area.
Okay.
And I love these questions. So we're going to do like a little rapid fire, like here's what they asked. So,
and if we don't get to answer all of them, I'm glad to then later on send an email to the students and respond to them, of course.
Perfect. So, all right, to kick us off, we have
Okay.
Aviv, a sixth grader from Schechter, who is curious to know, and this goes back to something you started to talk about. How do you think your Zadie and Bobe were treated when they arrived in Mexico?
Well, I have little fragments of the story that have come from my mom. I know that when they arrived to Mexico, there were Jewish people who either had family there already, or some people from the community would come to greet them. They did not have someone to come and greet them. So they arrived in Veracruz without anyone, say around 18-year-olds. So they had no one. So there was no one to really greet them. And they had to make their way from Veracruz. My understanding is that they ate some food and it did not sit well with them. So they fell asleep in some park in Veracruz, and a lot of the objects that they had brought with them were stolen. And they arrived later on, they took the train and arrived in Mexico City. But again, they knew no one. My understanding from my mom is that there was a younger kid that they were keeping an eye on, that another family had asked them to keep an eye as this one other Jewish kid was migrating as well. So again, some people had family or had someone from the Jewish community greet them. That was not the case for my grandparents.
Wow.
So
It's pretty incredible that they found their way.
Yes.
It's an amazing story. Okay, here's the next one. Shira, a sixth grader at Metro West Jewish Day School, asks.
I know Shira.
Oh, there we go. And I love this because I know parts of your answer. But is the project coming out the way you initially thought it would for the fellowship?
Oh, wow, Shira. Sometimes I have some ideas, but it's not all cemented. And while usually my work has been put on walls because it's a lot of photography based, I think it's been evolving a little bit. I didn't really think I was going to end up making artist books, but it seemed to me we don't have the space to hang the work on a wall, right? We're not together, but I could be making these books, and then in making them, it's another format to tell the story, right? I mean, there's something so precious about bookmaking, and you can tell the story. So it keeps evolving. I at this point, I think it's going to be a series of artist books, but it may change because as part of an artist is you have an idea, and then as you're making the piece, it keeps changing, right? So if you're open to allowing yourself to have an idea, but to allow it to change, then you open a lot of ways that it can go. So right now, I think it's going to be books, but I don't know. We'll find out in June when the fellowship comes to an end. And the work continues beyond the fellowship. Obviously, this is something very dear to me. So I don't know. We'll see.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we have Ruth, a seventh grader at the Jewish Community Day School, who'd like to know, what is your advice to young artists trying to find their style, preferences, and voice?
Well, one of the things I would recommend is don't try to copy other artists, right? Think about what you need to make, what you need to put out in paper, or maybe you're a sculptor, but what you need to put out from you, and experiment. Give yourself the chance to experiment. Don't get hung up on trying to make something perfect, right? Part of being an artist is that you allow multiple iterations of something. So I know that when I was around that age, everything had to be perfect or it wasn't good enough. And if I can offer the advice to sort of shake a little bit of that and make something that's meaningful to you, that you're attached to. And it's going to change as you get older, right? I mean, what I was interested in seventh grade changed, and it continues to change, but something that you like. What I do think is powerful is to get books of artists and look at their work, get inspired, or find them in the internet. So just look at artists. There's a website from PBS, Public Broadcasting Station. It's called Art21, and it has a whole bunch of different artists out there that you can look at the work. And I know, Laura, you have other resources, so maybe we can put a little guide of interesting resources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll send that out after. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
It's great. All right. Well, I promised you a short conversation and we are over time, but this has been wonderful. I promise you all out there that we'll do a follow-up, and or I hope you'll please join Adriana at some of her workshops over the course of the next few months. There are listings of events that are open to the public on the JR's website, of course. And I hope you will just photograph your objects. We'll send out the link that Adriana mentioned in the email to follow so that you can participate in this project as well. But thank you, Adriana. This has been so much fun.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for creating the space for this conversation. And thank you to everyone who's shown up and given a little bit of their time. And I'm hoping that it creates possibilities for us to continue to make art at this time and post, the pandemic. Yes.
That's absolutely it. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll join us next up with violinist Ilana Zaks on Wednesday, March 10th at 7 p.m. for the next edition of JLive. And of course, if you enjoyed this conversation, please remember that our JArts programs rely on generous community support like yours. So please pay it forward and make a donation to JArts now. But aside from that, thank you so much, Adriana. This has been great. Until
Laura,
soon.
always great. Thank you so much. See you soon. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. Appreciate it.